It was one of those evenings where the air inside the hotel felt different from the air outside. The massive lobby of the Ritz was glowing with warm golden light, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers hanging high above. Everything about the night screamed expensive. The floor was so clean you could eat off it, and the smell in the room was a mix of expensive perfume, fresh flowers, and rich food. It was the night of the big charity gala, the kind of event where people go just to be seen. The room was filled with the city's most important people. Men stood around in stiff black tuxedos, holding glasses of champagne and checking their expensive watches. Women wore long, sparkling dresses that made soft swishing sounds when they walked, their necks heavy with diamonds. They moved in small circles, smiling polite smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. They were talking about things that only mattered to them: stock markets, vacation homes, and who was wearing whose designer dress. It was a world of perfection. Everyone looked perfect, acted perfect, and tried hard to make sure everyone else knew they belonged there. In the far corner of the lobby, almost like a piece of art itself, sat a grand piano. It was a massive Steinway, black and shiny. The wood was polished so brightly that it acted like a mirror, reflecting the fancy lights of the room. A small velvet rope was stanchioned around it, telling everyone that this instrument was not just for anyone. It was a status symbol. Waiters walked by it carefully, and guests nodded at it approvingly, even though most of them probably didn't know the first thing about playing music. It was just there to look expensive. While the rich enjoyed their bubble of comfort, the heavy glass doors at the front of the hotel swung open. Usually, when these doors opened, a gust of cool, conditioned air would rush out, accompanied by a famous couple stepping out of a long limousine. But this time, the figure that stepped in wasn't tall. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. And he certainly didn't look like he belonged. A little boy, no older than 10, walked into the lobby. The contrast was shocking. He was a tiny figure in a room full of tall, confident adults. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt that looked like it had seen better days and a pair of jeans that were frayed at the hems. His sneakers were dirty, with one lace untied and dragging on the pristine carpet. His hair was messy, sticking up in the back, and there was a distinct smudge of dirt on his cheek, right under his eye. He looked like he had been running through the city streets all day, maybe playing in the park or helping his parents at work. For a moment, nobody noticed him. The lobby was huge, and he was small. He didn't walk with the rush of an employee or the strut of a guest. He walked slowly, his head tilted back, staring up at the high ceiling and the giant lights. His eyes were wide, taking everything in. He looked like an explorer who had stumbled into a hidden cave of treasure. Then, the woman standing nearest to the door turned around. She was holding a glass of red wine, wearing a dress that probably cost more than the boy's parents made in a year. She stopped mid-sentence when she saw him. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of sharp confusion. Then, her eyes narrowed. The boy didn't look at her. He was too busy looking at a large flower arrangement on a table. He reached out to touch a petal but pulled his hand back, remembering he shouldn't touch. This small action made the woman scoff. She nudged the man next to her, a heavy-set man in a bow tie. "Look at that," she whispered, not quietly enough. "Where do you suppose he came from?" The man looked down, sneering at the boy's dirty sneakers. "Lost, probably. Or looking for a place to sleep." More people began to notice. The ripple effect moved through the crowd like a wave. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The feeling of easy luxury was replaced by a stiff tension. The guests didn't see a child, They saw an intrusion. They saw a spot of dirt on their clean evening. They pulled their purses closer to their sides and stepped back, as if whatever messiness the boy had might be contagious. "Where is security?" a voice hissed from near the bar. "How did he get past the front desk? Maybe he's with the staff." "No, he looks too messy." The boy, however, seemed oblivious to the staring eyes. Or maybe, he was just used to people looking at him differently. He didn't cower. He didn't run away. He took a few more steps into the room, his sneakers making a soft squeak on the marble floor that everyone seemed to hear over the music. He wasn't interested in the food tables. He wasn't interested in the people. He was on a mission. He stopped in the middle of the room and turned his head. His eyes scanned the room until they locked onto the corner. There it was. The piano. The boy's face changed. The look of wonder on his face focused into something sharper. He started walking toward it, ignoring the velvet ropes, ignoring the glares. He walked past a group of men laughing loudly at a joke. As he passed them, one of them elbowed his friend and pointed at the boy. "Hey, kid," the man called out, his voice loud and mocking. "This isn't a playground. Did you get lost on your way to the arcade?" A few people around him chuckled. It was a cruel laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they feel superior. They thought it was funny. They thought the boy was going to embarrass himself or get thrown out, and they wanted to watch. The boy didn't even flinch. He didn't look at the man. He kept his eyes on the piano. He walked past the velvet rope, ducking under it carefully. A waiter nearby froze, holding a tray high, looking nervously toward the guards at the door. But no one moved yet. They were all too curious to see what this scruffy little kid was going to do next. He walked right up to the massive instrument. It towered over him. If he stood on his tiptoes, he might just be able to see the top of it. He stood there for a moment, just inches away from the glossy black wood. The room went quiet. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant clink of a glass being set down on a table. He reached out a small, rough hand. His fingernails were bitten short. There was grease on his knuckles. It was a hand that belonged to a kid who worked and played hard. "Don't touch that," a woman's voice shrieked from the crowd. "It's worth a fortune." A few more people laughed nervously. They were waiting for the alarm to go off, or for a guard to tackle him. They were waiting for the show to end so they could go back to their champagne. But the boy didn't listen. He placed his hand gently on the side of the piano, feeling the cold, smooth vibration of the wood. He closed his eyes for a second, taking a deep breath, as if the piano had a scent he wanted to remember. Then, he opened his eyes, walked around the bench, and climbed up. He had to hop a little to get his bottom onto the leather seat. His feet dangled high above the ground, nowhere near the pedals. He shuffled forward on the bench, getting closer to the keys. The crowd held its breath. This was it. They expected him to bang on the keys. They expected a terrible noise, a disruption, a reason to point and say, "See, children don't belong here." The men by the bar crossed their arms, smirking. The women whispered behind their hands. But the boy didn't bang. He didn't hit a single note yet. He just sat there, his back straightening slightly. He placed his hands in his lap, then raised them slowly, hovering his fingers over the ivory and ebony keys. His messy hair and dirty clothes looked completely out of place in front of such a majestic instrument. The contrast was almost painful to look at the wealth of the room versus the poverty of the boy. For that split second, everyone laughed. They laughed at the picture he made. They laughed at the absurdity of it. But the laughter died in their throats the moment his fingers touched the keys. The sound that started as a few giggles quickly grew into a loud rumble of laughter that bounced off the high ceilings. It wasn't the kind of laughter you hear when someone tells a joke. It was sharper, colder. It was the laugh of people who felt safe in their own little world, looking down at someone who didn't fit in. To them, the boy sitting on that leather bench wasn't a human being with feelings, he was just a joke, a momentary break in their boring evening of champagne and small talk. "Look at him!" A man near the front shouted out, pointing a finger. "He thinks he's at a concert." The group around him roared with laughter. Another guest, a woman with a tight pearl necklace, held her hand over her mouth to hide her smile, but her eyes were cruel. "Someone get a camera," she whispered to her friend. "This is going to be hilarious." The boy sat with his back to them. He couldn't see their faces, but he must have heard them. It would have been impossible not to. The lobby was huge, but their voices carried. Yet, he didn't turn around. He didn't cry. He didn't climb down and run away, which is what everyone expected him to do. Instead, he just sat there, his legs dangling, his feet swinging back and forth in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the music playing in the background. The contrast was painful for anyone who bothered to really look. There he was, a small kid in a shirt that had probably been washed 100 times, sitting in front of a machine that cost more than some houses. The piano was sleek and perfect, reflecting the image of the room. The boy was messy, his hair a tangle of curls, his skin dusty from the street. It looked like a blemish on a perfect painting, and the rich people in the room couldn't stop staring at it. "He's going to break something," a tall man in a gray suit said loudly. He sounded annoyed, like a fly was buzzing around his food. "That instrument is fragile. He's going to bang on it with those dirty hands." "I bet he plays with his elbows," someone else joked. "Or maybe just slams his head on the keys." A ripple of snickers went through the crowd. They were betting on how bad it would be. In their minds, there was no way this kid actually knew how to play. Why would kids like him, from their limited worldview, didn't take piano lessons? They didn't grow up with grand pianos in their living rooms. They were on the streets, or in schools that were falling apart. The idea that he might have talent was so foreign to them that it never even crossed their minds. Near the back of the room, a security guard finally started to make his way over. He walked slowly, casually, with the radio on his shoulder. He looked like he was just doing a routine check, but he was heading straight for the piano. The guests watched the guard with anticipation, smiling as they waited for the moment the troublemaker would be escorted out. They wanted their clean, perfect world back. The boy on the bench didn't notice the guard. Or if he did, he didn't care. He reached out with his right hand and hovered it over the keys. He didn't hit them. He just held his hand there, his fingers curved slightly, as if he were holding an invisible orange. It was a strange sight. Usually, kids just hit keys with flat palms. They bang. They make noise. But this boy looked serious. He looked like he was thinking. "Here we go," a man near the piano said, leaning in to watch. "Let us hear the disaster." The boy stretched his fingers. They were small fingers, certainly not big enough to reach some of the deep chords on the piano, but they looked strong. He wiped his palm quickly on his jeans, maybe to get rid of some sweat or dirt, and then placed both hands on the keys. He took a deep breath, his little shoulders rising and falling. The room seemed to hold its breath for a second, just out of curiosity. They were waiting for the bang. but it didn't come. The boy pressed a key. It wasn't a bang. It was a soft, clear note. A C note, right in the middle of the piano. Then he pressed another, and then another. He wasn't banging out chopsticks. He wasn't slamming his fists down. He was playing a scale. Slowly. Deliberately. The laughter in the room didn't stop immediately. It takes a moment for a crowd to realize that the joke isn't funny anymore. A few people were still chuckling, looking at their friends and rolling their eyes, thinking this was just the boring start before the real chaos began. "He's actually trying," one woman sneered, her voice dripping with pity. "It's adorable." "Really?" She took a sip of her drink, waiting for him to mess up. She expected him to hit a wrong note, to lose the rhythm, to prove that he was just a kid pretending to be something he wasn't. But the boy didn't mess up. The scale went up, and then it came back down. Perfectly. Every note was clear. Every note was in time. It was simple, yes, but it was precise. There was a weight to the way he touched the keys, a confidence that didn't match his small size. Then, his hands moved. He changed his position on the bench, shuffling closer to the edge so he could reach higher. He didn't look at his hands. He stared straight ahead at the music rack, even though there was no music there. He was looking at something in his own mind. He started to play a melody. It wasn't a famous pop song. It wasn't a nursery rhyme. It was something classical, something old, and serious. The laughter in the room began to falter. It wasn't a sudden silence, it was more like a wave slowly pulling back from the shore. The man who had been mocking him from the front row stopped smiling. He tilted his head to the side, a confused look on his face. The woman with the pearls lowered her glass. The security guard, who was only a few feet away now, stopped walking. The music was getting louder. The boy wasn't just pressing keys anymore, he was striking them. But he was striking them with a strange kind of grace. His left hand was playing a deep, rhythmic bass line, while his right hand was dancing over the higher notes. It was complex. It was fast. The people in the back of the room stopped talking. They turned away from their drinks and their friends to look at the corner. The hum of conversation that usually fills a hotel lobby was dying away, being replaced by the sound of the piano. The sound filled the space, pushing against the velvet curtains and the crystal chandeliers. The boy's face was intense. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't performing for them. He was fighting the music. He was biting his lip, his brow furrowed in concentration, his body swayed slightly with the rhythm. It was like he had forgotten where he was. He wasn't in a hotel full of rich people anymore. He was in his own world, and he was dragging them into it, whether they wanted to go or not. A teenager in the crowd, who had been scrolling on his phone and barely paying attention, looked up. His mouth opened slightly. He knew a little about music, he played in the school band. He knew that what this kid was playing wasn't easy. It required strength. It required speed. And this kid, with the dirty shirt and the messy hair, was doing it effortlessly. "I don't." A woman whispered, but she didn't finish her sentence. The boy's feet finally found the pedals. He had to stretch his legs all the way out, reaching for the gold pedals at the floor. He pressed one down, and the sound of the piano suddenly bloomed. It became richer, louder, deeper. The sustain made the notes blend together in a way that sounded almost like magic. That was the moment the laughter died completely. The silence that took over the room was heavy. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the silence of people realizing they had made a terrible mistake. The man who had joked about the boy breaking his precious instrument felt a sudden heat in his cheeks. The woman who wanted to take a photo felt ashamed and lowered her phone into her purse. They were confused. They were shocked. But mostly, they were just listening. They couldn't help it. The music was too strong to ignore. It was pulling them in, forcing them to see the little boy not as a dirty intruder, but as someone who commanded the room. The boy didn't stop. He didn't look up to see if they were impressed. He just kept playing, his hands moving faster now, the music rushing forward like a river. He was just getting started, and the hundreds of people standing around him stood frozen, captivated by the sound coming from the little boy who touched the piano. The sound that poured out of the piano wasn't just music anymore, it was a living, breathing thing that grabbed hold of the room. The boy's fingers, which had moments ago been hovering uncertainly, were now moving with a speed and strength that seemed impossible for someone so small. He wasn't just hitting notes. He was carving the air with sound. The melody was complex and fast, weaving through high, tinkling notes one moment and dropping down into deep, thunderous chords the next. The silence that had fallen over the lobby was strange. In a place like this, usually filled with the noise of gossip, clinking glasses, and footsteps, the sudden quiet felt heavy. It pressed against everyone's ears. The only thing that existed was the rhythm flying from the boy's hands. The sound was so clear, so sharp, that it seemed to vibrate right through the floor and up the legs of the people standing there. It was like they could feel the music in their chests. The boy's face, just moments ago a picture of innocent concentration, had changed completely. His eyes were squeezed shut, his eyebrows drawn together in a tight frown. He looked like he was fighting a battle. Every muscle in his small arms was tight. When he hit a particularly loud chord, he would bounce slightly on the bench, using his whole body to put weight behind the note. A lock of his messy hair fell over his forehead, but he didn't shake it away. He didn't dare stop. He had found the pedals now. His sneakers were stretching out, searching for the gold pedals at the floor. He couldn't reach them comfortably, so he had to slide forward on the leather seat until he was barely sitting, balancing on the edge. But he made it work. Every time he pressed that sustain pedal down, the sound of the piano bloomed, filling the entire cavernous lobby. The notes hung in the air, echoing off the marble walls, wrapping around the expensive chandeliers. The people who had been laughing just minutes ago were now statues. The man in the gray suit who had joked about the boy polishing the piano was standing with his mouth slightly open. His glass of champagne was held loosely in his hand, forgotten. He wasn't looking at his friends anymore. He was staring at the boy's hands. It didn't make sense to him. He knew how hard it was to get good at things. He spent years building his business, and he knew talent when he saw it. And this was raw, terrifying talent. Near the bar, a woman who had been fixing her makeup in a compact mirror slowly lowered it. She had seen the boy's dirty shirt. She had seen the smudge on his cheek. She had judged him instantly, assuming he was a nuisance. But now, watching his fingers fly across the keys, she felt a strange knot form in her stomach. It was the feeling of guilt. She realized that the dirty little boy was more of an artist in that moment than she would ever be. She closed her mirror with a soft snap, ashamed to be looking at herself when such beauty was happening right there. Even the staff had frozen. Waiters who were carrying heavy trays stopped walking, careful not to make a sound, afraid that the clinking of silverware might break the spell. A bartender reaching for a bottle paused, his hand hovering in mid-air. The security guard who had been walking over to escort the boy out was now standing still about 10 feet away. He had his radio in his hand, but his thumb wasn't on the button. He was just watching, a look of pure respect softening his usually stern face. He knew trouble when he saw it, and he knew this wasn't it. This was something else. The music began to shift. The boy moved from the fast, running notes into a slower, more emotional section. The sound became deeper, sadder. The notes seemed to cry out. It was a sound that touched something deep inside the people listening. It was the kind of music that reminded you of things you had lost, or dreams you used to have. The fancy people in their expensive clothes weren't thinking about stocks or parties anymore. They were just listening. For the first time all night, they were feeling something real. The boy's dirty t-shirt was becoming damp with sweat. He was working hard. You could see it in the way his shoulders rose and fell. This wasn't a trick. He wasn't a robot. He was a human being pouring everything he had into the instrument. It was exhausting just to watch him, but no one could look away. A teenager in the corner, who had been leaning against a pillar looking bored and scrolling through his phone, finally put the device in his pocket. He stepped closer to the rope line, his eyes wide. He played the guitar, and he knew how difficult music theory was. He could see that the boy wasn't reading any music. He was playing from memory, or maybe from the heart. The complexity of the chords was confusing, yet the boy played them as if they were as simple as breathing. "Why is he so good?" the teenager whispered to himself, but the words were swallowed by the music. The boy didn't know they were watching. He didn't know they were stunned. In his mind, maybe he was back in his small room, or maybe he was in a concert hall in his imagination. The piano was his escape. It was the one thing in the world that listened to him, that let him speak without words. And right now, he was shouting. He hit a series of high notes that rang out like crystal bells. The sound was so pure that it made the hairs on people's arms stand up. It cut through the pretension of the room like a knife. It washed away the smell of perfume and money and replaced it with something raw and honest. The man who had sneered at the boy's sneakers felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest. It was regret. He looked at his own expensive shoes, then back at the boy's worn-out ones. He realized that while he had spent his life buying things, this boy had spent his life creating something. The gap between them wasn't money anymore. The gap was talent. And the boy was standing on the high ground. The boy's hands were moving so fast now that they were almost a blur. The rhythm was driving, pounding, like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. The entire room seemed to pulse with it. The vibration of the piano was shaking the floor, trembling up the legs of the guests. They weren't just hearing the music, they were experiencing it. A young child, who had come with her parents and was holding a balloon, let go of the string. The balloon floated up toward the ceiling, ignored. The little girl didn't cry. She was too busy watching the boy on the bench. She didn't see a poor kid. She saw a magician. She clapped her hands together softly, her eyes shining with wonder, not seeing the dirt, only seeing the magic. The intensity was building. The boy was heading toward the end of the piece, and the music was getting louder, fuller. He was playing with both hands, sometimes crossing them over each other, reaching for notes that seemed impossible. His body was swaying violently now, lost in the storm of the song. The dirt on his face was hidden in shadow, lit only by the soft glow of the chandeliers, making him look almost angelic in a gritty, real way. The room was completely under his spell now. The judgment, the laughter, the arrogance, it had all vanished. In its place was a profound sense of awe. The air in the lobby felt different. It felt electric. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, afraid that if they exhaled, the moment would shatter. They were trapped in the web of notes spun by a little boy in a t-shirt. They were no longer the rich and powerful. They were just an audience, humbled by the power of true genius. The music wasn't just filling the room anymore, it felt like it was rewriting the air itself. Every note that the boy struck seemed to push against the walls of the expensive hotel, making the chandeliers shiver with invisible vibrations. The melody had become a storm, fast and furious, yet somehow incredibly clear. It wasn't just noise, it was a story. It was a story of struggle, of climbing up a steep hill, of fighting against gravity, and it was being told by a pair of small, dirty hands that moved faster than the eye could follow. The boy had completely disappeared. In his place on the bench sat a master, a force of nature. His body swayed violently with the rhythm. He wasn't sitting politely like the piano teachers in the schools might demand. He was leaning into the instrument, almost attacking it, pulling sound out of the wood and strings. When he played a deep, low note, he would stomp his foot on the floor, even though he was too small to reach the pedal properly. His whole body was involved. His messy hair flopped over his eyes, sweat dripping down his forehead and onto his upper lip, but he didn't stop to wipe it away. He didn't care about the sweat. He didn't care about the dirt on his cheek. He only cared about the music. The people watching were caught in a trance. The man in the gray suit, the one who had been so concerned about the Polish on the piano, now looked as if he had seen a ghost. His drink was still in his hand, but his knuckles were white from gripping the glass so hard. He was a man who was used to being in control, used to understanding the world around him. Money made sense to him. Business made sense to him. But this was a mystery. He looked at the boy's hands and couldn't understand how so much power could come from someone so small. For the first time in years, he felt small. The realization hit him hard. No amount of money in his bank account could buy the talent that was exploding out of this child. Near the back, a woman in a bright red dress was crying. She hadn't planned to cry. It was a happy event, a night for celebration. But the music was cutting through her defenses. It was touching a part of her heart that she kept locked away, the part that remembered being young and having dreams that were too big for the world she lived in. She watched the boy, saw the fierce determination in his face, and she felt a pang of guilt. She remembered all the times she had looked down on people who had less than her. She remembered judging people by their shoes or their jobs. And here was this boy, with nothing but a t-shirt and a pair of worn-out sneakers, showing her more beauty in 5 minutes than she had seen in 5 years. The piano sang out a series of high, cascading notes that sounded like rain falling on a tin roof, fast and frantic. The boy's right hand was a blur, dancing across the ivory keys with a precision that was terrifying. Then, suddenly, his left hand took over, crashing down with heavy, thunderous chords that shook the floorboards. It was like a battle between the light and the dark, the high and the low. The boy was the conductor of this war, and he was winning. A teenager who had been leaning against a pillar, trying to look cool and unimpressed, slowly slid down until he was standing with both feet flat on the ground. He had his arms crossed tightly over his chest, a defensive posture, but his eyes were wide. He knew how hard it was to learn an instrument. He knew the hours of boring practice, the frustration of not being able to get a song right. And he knew, with a certainty that scared him, that what this boy was doing was not something you learned in a few months. This was God-given. This was magic. The teenager felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that he had wasted his own time, that he had taken his opportunities for granted, while this boy probably had to fight just to get near a piano. The security guard who had been ready to drag the boy out was now standing at attention, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a soldier saluting a general. He didn't care about the rules anymore. You don't interrupt a genius. You don't stop a miracle. He watched the boy's feet, struggling to reach the pedals, and he saw the pure grit in the child's posture. The guard had seen a lot of things in his job: drunk guests, thieves, spoiled celebrities, but he had never seen anything like this. It made him proud, in a strange way. Proud of a kid he didn't even know. The intensity of the music kept rising. It felt like the boy was climbing a mountain. The notes became faster, the rhythm more driving. He was playing at a speed that seemed impossible for human fingers. The sound was filling every corner of the lobby, drowning out the thoughts of everyone there. It washed away their judgments, their prejudices, and their social status differences. In that moment, nobody was rich and nobody was poor. Everyone was just a listener, united by the sound. Then, the boy hit a patch of music that was softer, almost tender. The loud crashing stopped, replaced by a gentle, flowing melody. It was like the sun coming out after a storm. The change was so sudden that it made people gasp. The boy's face softened too. The fierce frown relaxed, and for a second, he looked peaceful. He stroked the keys like he was petting a cat. The tenderness in his touch was heartbreaking. It showed that despite the rough exterior, despite the dirt and the messy clothes, this boy had a gentle soul. He had love inside him that he didn't know how to express with words, so he let the piano say it for him. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioner humming. The silence was respectful. It was the kind of silence you give to a king or a hero. The guests were leaning in, afraid to miss a single note. They were witnessing something that doesn't happen often in life: a perfect moment. A moment where time seems to stop. The fancy clothes, the expensive jewelry, the polished floors, none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was the boy and the piano. The boy's breathing was getting heavy. You could see his chest heaving under his faded t-shirt. He was pouring every ounce of energy he had into the performance. He was giving it everything, not because he wanted to impress the people in the room, but because he couldn't help it. The music was inside him, and it had to come out. He was playing for his life. He was playing for every time he had been ignored, every time he had been told he wasn't good enough, every time he had been looked down upon. And in this music, he was winning. The melody began to build up again, heading toward the end. It started low and slow, climbing higher and higher, getting faster and louder with every measure. The anticipation in the room was unbearable. People were holding their breath without realizing it. Their hearts were beating in time with the rhythm the boy was creating. They were on the edge of their seats, waiting, needing to know how it would end. The boy's hands were flying now, a storm of motion. He stood up slightly on the bench to put more weight into the final notes. His eyes were shut tight, his face a mask of pure emotion. He wasn't a little boy anymore. He was a giant. The sound was huge, filling the world, shaking the heavens. He was driving toward the finish line, pushing the piano to its limits, pushing himself to his limits. And the audience, the rich, the proud, the cynical, they were all with him. They were all on that journey, carried by the magic of a little boy who touched the piano. The boy's hands came down on the final chords with a force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the hotel. It wasn't just sound, it was an explosion of emotion. He played the last sequence with a blinding speed, his fingers flying across the keys like they were possessed by some invisible spirit. And then, suddenly, his hands shot up into the air, frozen in a dramatic pause above the keys. The final note hung in the air, shimmering and echoing against the high ceiling. It was a heavy, powerful sound that seemed to suspend time itself. The boy sat there, panting, his chest heaving up and down under his thin, worn-out t-shirt. His hands were still hovering over the piano, trembling slightly from the effort. Sweat was dripping from his nose, but he didn't move to wipe it. His eyes were still closed, as if he were listening to the ghost of the note as it slowly faded away into silence. The lobby was absolutely, terrifyingly quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like a thick blanket has been thrown over a crowd. No one breathed. No one moved. The clink of ice in glasses had stopped completely. Even the air conditioners seemed to hum quieter. For 5, maybe 10 seconds, the only thing that existed was the vibration of that last chord disappearing into the walls. Then, a man in the back row let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for an hour. It was a shaky, audible sound. That broke the spell. Suddenly, the silence shattered. It didn't start with polite clapping. It started with a roar. It was like a dam breaking. The woman in the red dress didn't just clap, she screamed, "Bravo!" Her voice was raw with emotion. The man in the gray suit dropped his glass well, almost dropped it, fumbling to catch it, but he didn't care about the drink. He started clapping so hard his palms turned red. The applause swept through the room like a tidal wave. One by one, people stood up. The guests, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had sneered, the ones who had looked down their noses, they were all on their feet now. It was a standing ovation. Not the polite kind you do out of boredom, but the kind where people are desperate to show their appreciation. They were cheering, whistling, and shouting. Some people were crying openly, wiping tears from their eyes with handkerchiefs and napkins. The security guard was clapping his hands together, a huge grin on his face. The waiters were stopping their work to applaud. It was a deafening sound, a wall of noise that was meant for a rock star, not a little boy in dirty clothes. But the boy didn't seem to hear it. He slowly opened his eyes. He lowered his hands and placed them gently on his lap. He looked out at the crowd, blinking, as if surprised to see them there. For a second, he looked confused. He looked at the hundreds of people standing and cheering for him, and a small, shy smile touched his lips. It wasn't a smug smile. It was the smile of someone who was just happy the music sounded right. He didn't bow. He didn't wave his hands in the air like a conductor. He didn't say, "Thank you." He just sat there for a moment, taking it all in with a simple innocence that was more powerful than any speech could have been. Then, the moment was over. He let out a big sigh, wiped his nose on the sleeve of his shirt, and shuffled his bottom to the edge of the bench. He hopped off, landing on the marble floor with a soft thud. He reached up and gave the side of the piano a gentle pat, like you would pat a dog that just did a good trick. It was a gesture of pure love. "Good job," the pat seemed to say. "We did it." He turned around to walk away. The crowd didn't stop cheering, but they parted for him. It was like the Red Sea parting. People stepped back, making a wide path for him. No one reached out to touch him. No one stopped him to ask his name. They just watched him, their faces filled with a mix of awe and respect. The woman who had wanted to take a photo earlier stood frozen, her phone in her hand, but she didn't take a picture. She just watched him walk by, realizing that a photo couldn't capture what had just happened. The boy walked with his hands in his pockets, his head down a little. He didn't walk like a celebrity. He walked like a tired kid who wanted to go home. His sneakers squeaked softly on the floor, a small, humble sound in the middle of the roaring applause. As he passed the security guard, the guard looked down at him and gave him a solemn nod. The boy looked up, flashed a quick, toothy grin, and kept walking. He walked past the velvet ropes, past the expensive flower arrangements, and past the judging eyes that were now filled with admiration. He reached the heavy glass doors at the entrance. The doorman, who had watched the whole thing from his post, rushed to open the door for him. He didn't open it just a little bit, he threw it wide open, holding it with both hands, standing at attention like he was opening the door for a king. The boy paused for a second on the threshold. He looked out into the night, where the city lights were blinking. He stepped out into the cool air. The glass doors swung shut behind him, closing off the sound of the applause and the warmth of the hotel lobby. Inside, the cheering slowly died down. People stood there for a long time, looking at the empty bench, then at the shiny black piano. The room felt different. It wasn't just a fancy hotel anymore. It was a place where something magical had happened. The man in the gray suit walked slowly up to the piano. He looked at the keys, still imagining the boy's hands flying over them. He felt a strange feeling in his chest, a humbling feeling. He realized that he had learned a lesson that night that no business school could teach him. He learned that you should never judge a book by its cover, and that true brilliance comes from the heart, not the wallet. The lobby stayed quiet for a long time. The guests went back to their drinks, but the conversation had changed. They weren't talking about stocks or houses anymore. They were talking about the boy. They were talking about the music. And every time they looked at the piano for the rest of the night, they saw a little boy in a faded t-shirt, playing his heart out. The boy, meanwhile, was just a silhouette disappearing down the street. He didn't know that he had changed people's lives. He didn't know that he had made a room full of rich people feel something real. He was just walking home, perhaps humming the tune he had just played, carrying the music inside him, invisible and free. And as the night went on, the story of the boy who touched the piano began to spread, becoming a legend that people would talk about for years to come.